My name is Eleanor May Whitfield, and I'm 78 years old. For 55 years, I believed in the sacred promise of marriage, through sickness and health, for richer or poorer, till death do us part. I spent my entire adult life building a home, raising children, and standing by my husband's side through every triumph and hardship. I thought loyalty meant something. I thought love conquered all. I was wrong. It was a Tuesday morning in October when my world crumbled. I was in our kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd cooked thousands of meals, packed countless school lunches, and celebrated every holiday for decades. The autumn light filtered through the yellow curtains I'd sewn myself 20 years ago, casting familiar shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Charles sat at our breakfast table, stirring his coffee with the same methodical precision he'd used for half a century. But something was different that morning. His hands trembled slightly, not from age but from nerves. His weathered face, marked by 82 years of life and 40 years of teaching high school mathematics, carried an expression I'd never seen before. Guilt mixed with something that looked almost like excitement. "Eleanor," he said, not meeting my eyes. "We need to talk." Those 4 words struck fear into my heart. In 55 years of marriage, Charles had never been one for dramatic conversations. He was steady, predictable, safe. When he finally looked up at me, I saw a stranger wearing my husband's face. "I've fallen in love with someone else." The coffee mug slipped from my hands, shattering against the floor in a splash of brown liquid and white ceramic. The crash seemed to echo through our silent house, bouncing off walls that had witnessed our entire life together. Photographs of our children, grandchildren, and decades of memories watched from their frames as my marriage died in that kitchen. "Her name is Margaret Hayes," he continued, his voice growing stronger with each confession. "She's 65, a widow from our church. We've been seeing each other for 8 months. While I'd been caring for our home, attending church beside him every Sunday, preparing his favorite meals, and believing in our unbreakable bond, he'd been building a new life with another woman. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical pain I'd ever endured. "Margaret makes me feel alive again, Eleanor. She makes me feel young. At 78, after sacrificing my teaching career to raise our children, after nursing him through pneumonia, after supporting his dreams while burying my own, I wasn't young enough anymore. The girl who'd once dreamed of traveling the world, of writing novels, of painting landscapes. She was too old, too worn, too forgettable. The news spread through our small town like wildfire. At the grocery store, conversations stopped when I walked by. Mrs. Henderson from next door peered through her curtains with undisguised curiosity. Our children, Vivian and Harold, were forced to choose sides in a war I'd never wanted to fight. Vivian, our 45-year-old daughter, delivered her verdict during a tense phone call. "Maybe if you'd taken better care of yourself, Mom. Maybe if you'd tried to be more exciting, more interesting. Dad deserves to be happy." Her words stung worse than Charles's betrayal. My own daughter blamed me for not being enough, for aging, for becoming invisible in my own life. Harold, our 43-year-old son, offered gentle support but seemed lost in the wreckage of our family. "I don't understand, Dad," he said during one of his visits. "How could he throw away everything you built together?" I didn't have an answer. How could 5 decades of shared history, of building a life together, of weathering storms and celebrating joys, be erased by the promise of feeling young again? The humiliation was suffocating. At church, I sat alone in the pew where Charles and I had worshipped together for decades. People who'd known us since we were newlyweds now whispered behind their hymnals. Some offered sympathetic smiles, but most seemed fascinated by the scandal of an old man leaving his elderly wife for a younger woman. Margaret Hayes made her first public appearance with Charles at the annual church picnic. She was everything I was not: vibrant, confident, financially independent. Her silver hair was styled in a modern cut, her clothes were fashionable and expensive, and she laughed with a kind of carefree joy I'd forgotten existed. When Charles looked at her, his eyes sparkled with an intensity one hadn't seen in years. I watched from across the picnic grounds as he held her hand, as he whispered in her ear, as he became the man I'd once fallen in love with, just not with me. The other church members were torn between social propriety and morbid curiosity. Some approached me with awkward condolences, as if Charles had died rather than simply chosen someone else. That night I sat alone in our kitchen, my kitchen now, I supposed. The house felt enormous and empty, filled with echoes of a life that no longer existed. Every corner held memories. The spot where we'd shared our first dance as homeowners, the table where we'd helped our children with homework, the window where I'd watched Charles plant our garden every spring. The silence was deafening. For 55 years, this house had been filled with conversation, laughter, arguments, and the comfortable quiet of two people who belonged together. Now it was just quiet, the hollow quiet of abandonment. I picked up the fragments of the coffee mug I'd dropped that morning, cutting my finger on a sharp edge. As I watched the blood drip onto the kitchen floor, I realized this was what betrayal felt like. Sharp, unexpected, leaving you wounded and staining everything around you. Sitting in the darkness, surrounded by the ghosts of our shared past, I whispered the words that would haunt me for weeks to come. After 55 years of marriage, he chose her over me. Margaret Hayes was everything I was not, and she made sure everyone knew it. At 65, she possessed the kind of confidence that comes from never having to sacrifice your dreams for someone else's. Her late husband, Robert Hayes, had left her with a comfortable fortune and the freedom to live exactly as she pleased. I learned about Margaret through the cruel gossip network of our small town. She'd moved here 3 years ago after Robert's death, buying the restored Victorian house on Maple Street with cash. While I'd spent decades clipping coupons and stretching our modest teacher's pension, Margaret shopped at boutiques in the city and drove a silver Lexus that sparkled in the church parking lot every Sunday. She was beautiful in the way that money allows. Professionally maintained, expertly styled, untouched by the wear of worry or financial stress. Her silver hair fell in perfect waves, her skin glowed with expensive treatments, and her clothes spoke of a life free from practical concerns. When she smiled, which she did often and brilliantly, perfect white teeth gleamed against perfectly applied lipstick. But it wasn't just her appearance that captivated Charles. Margaret was everything I'd never been allowed to be. She was adventurous, planning trips to Europe and wine-tasting tours in California. She was spontaneous, suggesting midnight drives and impromptu dinner dates. She was independent, with her own money, her own car, her own life that she was graciously willing to share. I, on the other hand, had spent my youth caring for our home and children. While Margaret was discovering herself in her 50s after her husband's death, I was helping Charles navigate retirement and health scares. While she was learning to tango and taking art classes, I was managing doctor's appointments and medication schedules. The comparison was devastating and it consumed me. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror each morning, cataloging every line, every age spot, every sign of the years I'd spent living for others. My hands, once soft and young, were now spotted and veined from decades of housework and gardening. My figure, once trim and admired, had softened and settled into the comfortable shape of a woman who'd borne children and baked countless birthday cakes. When had I become invisible? When had I stopped being a woman and become simply a wife, a mother, a caretaker? The cruel truth was that Margaret offered Charles something I couldn't, the promise of reinvention. With her, he could pretend to be younger, more vital, more interesting than the mathematics teacher who'd spent 40 years explaining algebra to disinterested teenagers. With her, he could travel to places we'd only dreamed of visiting, eat at restaurants we'd considered too expensive, live the kind of life we'd always said we'd enjoy someday. Margaret had lived her someday. I was still waiting for mine. Vivian's words echoed in my mind during my darkest moments. Maybe if you'd taken better care of yourself, Mom. Maybe if you'd tried to be more exciting, more interesting. But when had I had time to be exciting? When Charles was building his career, I was home with babies who needed constant attention. When he was coaching the math team and earning respect in our community, I was volunteering at school fundraisers and keeping our household running smoothly. When he was looking forward to retirement adventures, I was caring for my aging mother until her death 5 years ago. I'd given him my youth, my dreams, my entire life, And apparently it wasn't enough. The town's reaction was mixed and painful to navigate. Some people, particularly the older women who'd known me for decades, offered quiet support. They understood the sacrifice, the invisible labor, the gradual disappearance that comes with dedicating your life to others. But others, especially the younger couples, seemed fascinated by the scandal and perhaps secretly relieved that it was happening to someone else. At the grocery store, I overheard Susan Patterson telling her friend, "Well, you can't really blame him. Margaret Hayes is stunning for her age, and she has that wonderful zest for life. Poor Eleanor always seemed so tired." Yes, I was tired. Tired from decades of early mornings and late nights. Tired from worrying about everyone else's happiness while neglecting my own. Tired from being grateful for scraps of attention from the man I'd loved with my whole heart. Harold tried to comfort me during his visits, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. He loved his father but couldn't understand how Charles could abandon the woman who'd made their family possible. "You deserved better, Mom," he'd say, but his words felt hollow against the weight of my abandonment. The nights were the worst. I'd lie in our king-sized bed, acutely aware of the empty space beside me. For 55 years I'd fallen asleep to the sound of Charles's breathing, the warmth of his presence, the security of knowing I wasn't alone. Now the bed felt enormous, cold, and impossibly empty. I tried to fill my days with activities, gardening, reading, organizing photo albums, but everything reminded me of what I'd lost. The rose bushes Charles and I had planted together. The books we'd discussed over morning coffee. The photographs of our family vacations, all of which had been planned around his schedule, his preferences, his dreams. 3 months after Charles's confession, the envelope arrived. It was thick, official, delivered by certified mail on a Thursday afternoon that had started like any other. My name was typed on expensive legal stationery. Mrs. Eleanor May Whitfield. Inside, pages of legal documents spelled out the end of everything I'd believed permanent. Charles wanted a divorce. After 55 years of marriage, he was asking a judge to legally dissolve our union so he could be free to marry Margaret Hayes. But that wasn't the worst part. He wanted the house. The house where I'd raised our children, where I'd built every memory worth keeping, where I'd planned to live out my remaining years surrounded by familiar comforts. He wanted to sell it and split the proceeds. The legal papers suggested I could use my half to secure appropriate housing for a woman of your age and circumstances. Appropriate housing. A small apartment perhaps, or assisted living. Somewhere I could disappear completely, conveniently forgotten by the man who'd promised to love me forever. I sat at our kitchen table, the divorce papers spread before me like a death certificate for our marriage, and felt something shift inside me. The devastation was still there, the humiliation and heartbreak and bone-deep exhaustion. But underneath it all, something else was stirring. Something that felt dangerously like anger. The divorce papers weren't just a legal document, they were a roadmap to my complete destruction. As I read through the cold, clinical language, the reality of my situation became brutally clear. Charles hadn't just abandoned our marriage. He'd systematically dismantled the financial security I'd helped build over 5 decades. Our joint bank accounts, carefully accumulated through years of modest teacher salaries and careful budgeting, had been quietly drained. The savings account we'd built for our golden years had dwindled from $43,000 to less than $800. Our checking account, once healthy with our combined pension deposits, now barely covered the monthly utilities. I discovered Charles's betrayal had been meticulously planned. For months, he'd been transferring money to a separate account I'd never known existed. While I'd been trusting him to manage our finances as he always had, he'd been funding his new life with Margaret Hayes. Expensive dinners, weekend getaways, gifts that I'd never received, all paid for with money I'd helped earn through decades of partnership. The lawyer who drafted the divorce papers had clearly been instructed to leave me with as little as possible. My half of the house proceeds, after legal fees and Charles's claims for separate property, would amount to perhaps $50,000. In our small town's inflated housing market, That wouldn't be enough for even the smallest apartment. I called Harold in desperation, my voice shaking as I tried to explain the financial devastation Charles had orchestrated. "Mom, I had no idea Dad was planning this," Harold said, his voice tight with anger and disbelief. "Vivian and I will help however we can, but with the kids' college expenses and Sarah's medical bills." "Understood. My children had their own lives, their own responsibilities." Harold worked as a middle school principal, comfortable but not wealthy. Vivian's husband had been laid off 6 months ago, and they were struggling to maintain their own household. I couldn't become their burden, another financial obligation in their already stretched lives. The reality was stark. At 78 years old, I was facing homelessness. I spent hours researching senior housing options online, my heart sinking with each website I visited. The decent facilities required waiting lists and entrance fees I couldn't afford. The places within my budget looked institutional and depressing. Sterile hallways, shared rooms, the smell of disinfectant and resignation. During one particularly dark afternoon, I visited Sunset Manor, the only senior living facility I could potentially afford. The director, a cheerful woman named Patricia, showed me through cramped rooms with thin walls and windows that looked out onto a parking lot. The common areas smelled of overcooked vegetables and loneliness. Residents sat in wheelchairs, staring at a television that played game shows at volumes meant to accommodate failing hearing. "We have a lovely community here," Patricia said with practiced enthusiasm. "Bingo on Tuesdays, religious services on Sundays, and the food is quite nutritious." I watched an elderly woman in a faded housecoat shuffling down the hallway with a walker, her eyes vacant and defeated. Was this what my life had come to? Was this the reward for 55 years of devotion and sacrifice? That night, I sat on my back porch in the darkness, surrounded by the garden Charles and I had cultivated together. The roses were blooming their final burst before winter, their fragrance sweet and melancholy in the cool air. This porch, this garden, this house, they were my life's work, the physical manifestation of everything I'd built and nurtured. The thought of losing it all felt like losing myself entirely. I prayed that night for the first time since Charles's confession. I'd been too angry, too hurt, too betrayed to speak to God in the months since my world collapsed. But sitting in the darkness, facing the possibility of spending my final years in institutional care, I found myself whispering desperate words into the night air. "Why?" I asked the stars above our garden. "Why, after everything I've given, everything I've sacrificed, must I suffer like this? Haven't I been faithful? Haven't I been good? Haven't I earned better than abandonment and poverty in my old age?" The silence was deafening. No divine voice offered comfort or guidance. No miracle appeared to solve my problems. There was only the night air, the scent of roses, and the crushing weight of my circumstances. But somewhere in that silence, something shifted. As I sat there in the darkness, feeling sorry for myself and my tragic fate, I began to remember the woman I'd been before marriage, and motherhood had shaped me into someone else. I remembered Eleanor May Thompson, the girl who'd grown up during the Depression and learned that survival required strength, creativity, and stubborn determination. My father had lost his job when I was 12, and my mother had taken in laundry to keep food on our table. We'd had nothing, but we'd survived through ingenuity and sheer will. I remembered the young woman who'd put herself through college by working 3 jobs and living on beans and rice. The woman who'd stood up to professors who thought female students were wasting classroom space. The woman who'd earned her teaching degree despite every obstacle society placed in her path. When had I forgotten that woman? When had I become so dependent, so passive, so willing to accept whatever life handed me? I thought about Margaret Hayes, with her confidence and her independence and her refusal to apologize for taking up space in the world. I thought about how she'd never had to choose between her dreams and her family's needs, how she'd never had to make herself smaller to accommodate someone else's ego. For 55 years, I'd been Eleanor Whitfield, the devoted wife and mother. I'd been proud of that identity, built my entire sense of self around being indispensable to others. But Charles's betrayal had shattered that foundation, leaving me with nothing but the truth. I was still Eleanor May Thompson underneath it all. And Eleanor May Thompson had never gone down without a fight. As the night air grew colder and the roses released their final perfume of the season, I made a decision that surprised me with its clarity and force. I would not shuffle quietly into assisted living. I would not disappear into the institutional anonymity of managed care. I would not allow Charles to erase me from the life we'd built together. I was 78 years old, nearly broke, and facing divorce proceedings designed to destroy me. But I was also a survivor, a fighter, a woman who'd overcome obstacles before and could do it again. Charles thought he could discard me like an old piece of furniture that no longer fit his decor. Margaret thought she could waltz into our community and claim the life I'd built without consequence. They were both about to learn they were wrong. The law office of Martinez and Associates occupied a converted Victorian house downtown, its cheerful yellow paint and welcoming front porch belying the serious business conducted within. I'd found Rebecca Martinez through Harold, who'd heard about her reputation for taking on cases others wouldn't touch. At 34, Rebecca was younger than my own children, but her handshake was firm and her eyes held the kind of sharp intelligence that gave me hope. She listened to my story without judgment, taking notes in precise handwriting as I explained Charles's financial betrayal and the divorce papers designed to leave me destitute. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said when I'd finished, "what your husband has done is called dissipation of marital assets. In most cases, the courts take a very dim view of one spouse secretly draining joint accounts to fund an affair. But I can't afford a lengthy legal battle," I admitted, my voice small with embarrassment. "I have less than $800 in my checking account." Rebecca leaned back in her chair, studying me with a kind of assessment that made me straighten my spine. "Tell me about your marriage. Not the romantic parts, the practical parts. Who did what? Who sacrificed what?" For the next hour I detailed the architecture of our partnership. How I'd left my teaching position when Vivian was born and never returned to full-time work. How I'd managed our household, raised our children, and supported Charles's career while he built the pension and Social Security benefits that now funded his new life. How my unpaid labor had made his professional success possible. "You," Rebecca said when I'd finished, "are entitled to far more than they're offering. Your husband's pension was earned during the marriage with your support. The house increased in value because of improvements you made and maintenance you performed. You're not a charity case, Mrs. Whitfield. You're a business partner being cheated out of your fair share." She agreed to take my case on a contingency basis, something she rarely did for divorce proceedings. "But," she warned, "we're going to have to fight dirty. Your husband's attorney is going to paint you as a dependent wife who contributed little to the marriage's financial success. We need to be prepared to expose everything, including why this marriage is really ending." The preparation for our legal battle consumed the next several weeks. Rebecca's team dug into Charles's financial records, uncovering a paper trail of his secret spending. 8 months of expensive dinners at restaurants we'd never frequented. Hotel receipts from weekend trips I'd never taken. Jewelry purchases from stores I'd never entered. More damaging was the timeline. Charles's relationship with Margaret had begun not 8 months ago, as he'd claimed, but over a year before his confession. They'd been meeting secretly, planning their future together, while I'd been caring for him during his bout with pneumonia. But the most devastating discovery came from Margaret herself. Rebecca had hired a private investigator, a former police detective named Tom Rodriguez who specialized in financial fraud cases. What Tom discovered about Margaret Hayes changed everything we thought we knew about Charles's new love. Margaret wasn't the grieving widow she claimed to be. Her late husband Robert hadn't died of natural causes. He'd committed suicide after discovering Margaret had embezzled nearly $200,000 from his accounting firm. The local newspaper in their previous town had covered the story, but the scandal had been hushed up to protect the firm's reputation. Margaret had used Robert's life insurance money to relocate and reinvent herself, choosing our small town specifically because no one would know her history. She'd targeted Charles deliberately, identifying him as a recently retired man with modest wealth and a wife who might not fight back. "She's done this before," Tom explained during a meeting in Rebecca's office. In her previous town, she was involved with 2 other married men before Robert's death. Both relationships ended when she'd extracted what she wanted financially. The evidence was damning. Forged signatures on documents, manipulated bank records, a pattern of financial abuse that stretched back decades. Margaret Hayes wasn't just a homewrecker. She was a predator who specialized in exploiting older men. Rebecca's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Rather than simply defending my rights to marital assets, we would expose Margaret's criminal history and Charles's willful blindness to it. We would demonstrate that his decision to leave me wasn't based on love or incompatibility, but on his manipulation by a woman with a documented history of fraud. The first court hearing was held on a Tuesday morning in November. I wore my best dress, a navy blue suit I'd bought for Harold's wedding 10 years earlier, and tried to project the dignity Rebecca had coached me to maintain. Charles sat across the courtroom with his attorney, a sharp-suited man named Davidson who specialized in protecting men's assets during late-life divorces. Charles looked older than his 82 years, his face drawn and his hands trembling slightly. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Margaret sat in the gallery behind him, dressed in an expensive cream-colored outfit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She watched the proceedings with the detached interest of someone attending a performance that didn't quite concern her. Rebecca's opening statement was devastating. She laid out the evidence of Charles's financial betrayal methodically, then introduced the bombshell of Margaret's criminal history. The judge, a stern woman named Patricia Hendricks, listened with increasing surprise and disapproval. When Rebecca presented the newspaper clippings about Robert Hayes's suicide and the embezzlement investigation, Margaret's composure cracked for the first time. Her face went pale, and she whispered urgently to Davidson, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Your Honor," Rebecca concluded, "my client isn't seeking revenge against a cheating husband. She's seeking protection from a predator who has already destroyed one family and is now attempting to destroy another." The court session ended with Judge Hendricks ordering a temporary freeze on all marital assets and scheduling a full hearing for the following month. Charles would have to account for every dollar he'd transferred, and Margaret would be required to testify about her relationship with him and her financial history. As we left the courthouse, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. For the first time since Charles's confession, I wasn't just reacting to what others were doing to me. I was fighting back. But the real shock came that evening, when Harold called with unexpected news. "Mom," he said, his voice strange with concern, "Dad's in the hospital. He collapsed at Margaret's house this afternoon. The doctors think it might be his heart." Mercy Hospital's cardiac wing smelled of antiseptic and fear, familiar scents from the months I'd spent caring for my mother before her death. Charles lay in bed 6, connected to monitors that beeped steadily, tracking the rhythm of the heart that had once belonged to me. At 82, he looked fragile in a way that surprised me. The man who'd betrayed our marriage, who'd planned to leave me destitute, seemed suddenly small and vulnerable beneath the white hospital sheets. His face was gray, his breathing shallow, and his eyes held a confusion that spoke of more than just medical distress. Margaret was nowhere to be seen. Harold and Vivian sat beside his bed, their faces etched with worry and something that looked like guilt. They'd spent the past months choosing sides in our divorce, and Charles's sudden illness had forced them to confront the possibility that their father might die estranged from the family he'd abandoned. "Mom," Vivian said when I entered the room, her voice small and uncertain, "I didn't think you'd come. I wasn't sure why I'd come either." Rebecca had warned me that visiting Charles could be seen as reconciliation, potentially weakening our legal position. But when Harold had called with the news of Charles's collapse, something deeper than legal strategy had compelled me to come. "He's been asking for you," Harold said quietly. "The doctor said he was agitated when he regained consciousness, asking if you knew he was here." As Charles's attorney read the will aloud, Margaret's face remained composed. The document was clear. Everything went to me. The house, the pension accounts, the life insurance policy, even Charles's modest investment portfolio. Margaret would receive nothing except a brief mention acknowledging her friendship during his final months. "My client," Margaret's attorney announced when the reading concluded, "will be filing a formal contest." Mr. Whitfield was clearly suffering from dementia when he signed this document. Ms. Hayes was his primary caregiver during his final illness, and it's unconscionable that she should be cut out of his estate entirely. Rebecca smiled with the satisfaction of a chess player who'd anticipated her opponent's move. "That's interesting, counselor, because we have evidence that your client was Mr. Whitfield's primary caregiver only when it was financially convenient." She opened her briefcase and withdrew a stack of hospital records, bank statements, and sworn affidavits. According to Mercy Hospital's visitor logs, Ms. Hayes visited Mr. Whitfield exactly twice during his final hospitalization. Meanwhile, Mrs. Whitfield was there daily, making medical decisions and providing the emotional support your client couldn't be bothered to offer. But the real bombshell came when Rebecca presented the evidence of Margaret's flight attempts. Tom Rodriguez had been monitoring Margaret's activities since Charles's death, discovering she'd already put her house on the market and opened new bank accounts in Florida. "Your Honor," Rebecca continued, addressing the probate judge, "Ms. Hayes isn't a grieving partner seeking her fair share. She's a flight risk attempting to liquidate assets and disappear, just as she did after her previous husband's death." Margaret's composure finally cracked. She leaned forward in her chair, whispering urgently to her attorney, who looked increasingly uncomfortable with each revelation. The newspaper clippings about Robert Hayes's suicide and the embezzlement investigation were entered into evidence, along with testimony from Margaret's former neighbors about her pattern of targeting vulnerable widowers. The judge, a stern man named Robert Chen, studied the evidence with obvious distaste. "Ms. Hayes," he said finally, "given your documented history of financial fraud and your current attempts to liquidate assets, this court finds no grounds for contesting Mr. Whitfield's final will. The document stands as written." Margaret's face went white with rage and defeat. As the courtroom emptied, she approached me with venom in her eyes. "You think you've won," she hissed, her carefully maintained composure finally shattered. "But you're still just a pathetic old woman whose husband chose someone else. At least I gave him excitement in his final months." "What did you give him?" 55 years of boredom and mediocrity. I looked at this woman who'd tried to destroy my life, who'd manipulated my husband and stolen my security, and felt nothing but pity. "I gave him love," I said simply. "Real love, not the performance you put on to rob him." And in the end, he remembered the difference. Margaret stormed out of the courthouse that day and disappeared from our town within the week. Her house sold quickly, probably at a loss, and she vanished as thoroughly as if she'd never existed. But the damage she'd caused couldn't be erased with her departure. Charles was gone. Our marriage, despite its legal vindication, remained broken beyond repair. Our children struggled to reconcile their love for their father with their anger at his betrayal. The community that had watched our drama unfold continued to whisper about the scandal of the old man who'd left his devoted wife for a con artist. But for the first time in months, I had something Margaret could never take away: my independence. The inheritance Charles had left me was more substantial than I'd realized. In addition to our house, now mortgage-free, there were retirement accounts I'd forgotten about, life insurance policies purchased decades ago, and investments that had grown quietly over the years. I wasn't wealthy, but I was secure in a way I'd never been as a dependent wife. More importantly, I was free. For 55 years, my life had revolved around other people's needs. Charles's career, our children's activities, my mother's declining health. I defined myself entirely through my service to others. Now, at 78, I was being forced to discover who Eleanor May Whitfield could be when she belonged only to herself. The first thing I did was renovate the house. Not to erase Charles's memory, but to reclaim the space as mine. I painted the bedroom a soft lavender, a color Charles had always disliked, and replaced the heavy furniture with pieces that felt light and hopeful. I converted his study into an art studio, buying easels and canvases and oil paints I'd dreamed of using for decades. I began painting again for the first time since college. My hands were less steady than they'd once been, but they remembered the joy of creating something beautiful from nothing. I painted the garden in all seasons, the view from my bedroom window, portraits of my grandchildren that captured their personalities in ways photographs never could. But the most meaningful change wasn't about the house or my hobbies. It was about how I chose to use my unexpected freedom. 3 months after Charles's funeral, I received a letter that changed everything. It came from Sarah Mitchell, a woman I'd known peripherally from church, written in shaky handwriting that spoke of age and desperation. "Dear Eleanor," it read, "I hope you don't mind me writing to you, but I didn't know where else to turn. My husband passed away 6 months ago, and I'm facing eviction from our apartment. The landlord says I can't afford the rent on my Social Security alone, and my children live too far away to help. I heard about what you went through with Margaret Hayes, and I wondered if you might have advice for someone else who feels lost and forgotten." Sarah's letter broke my heart because I recognized myself in her desperation. How many women in our community were facing similar situations? How many elderly widows were struggling with poverty, isolation, and the fear of becoming burdens to their families? I called Sarah that afternoon and invited her for coffee. She arrived looking embarrassed and defeated, wearing clothes that had seen better days and carrying herself with the apologetic posture of someone who'd learned to expect disappointment. Over the next hour, I listened to her story, familiar in its details of financial abandonment and social invisibility. Her husband had handled all their finances, and she'd never learned to navigate Social Security, Medicare, or the complex bureaucracy of aging in America. She was drowning in paperwork she didn't understand and bills she couldn't pay. "What if we helped each other?" I suggested as we finished our coffee. "I have a big house and more space than I need. You need affordable housing and someone who understands what you're going through. Maybe we could be housemates." Sarah's eyes filled with tears of relief and gratitude. "I couldn't impose on you like that, Eleanor. I have nothing to offer in return." "You have yourself to offer," I replied. "Your friendship, your company, your stories. I've been rattling around this house alone for months, talking to myself and feeling sorry for my circumstances. Maybe what we both need is community." Sarah moved into my guest room the following week, bringing her few possessions and a lifetime of experience I'd never had. She'd been a nurse before marriage and retirement, and she understood medical terminology and insurance forms that had always confused me. In return, I helped her navigate the financial planning she'd never learned to do for herself. But more than practical assistance, we offered each other something precious: the knowledge that we weren't invisible or forgotten. We were two women with decades of wisdom, experience, and life left to live. Word of our arrangement spread through our community's network of older women, and within months, I was receiving calls from others facing similar struggles. Some needed temporary housing during family transitions. Others needed help understanding Medicare or Social Security benefits. A few simply needed someone to listen to their stories and validate their experiences. I began hosting weekly coffee meetings in my living room, bringing together women who'd spent their lives caring for others and were now learning to care for themselves. We shared practical advice about everything from budgeting on fixed incomes to navigating healthcare systems. But more importantly, we shared our stories, tales of sacrifice and resilience, dreams deferred and wisdom earned through decades of living. The group grew organically, and we formalized it as the Golden Years Women's Network. With the inheritance Charles had left me, I was able to rent a small office downtown and hire a part-time coordinator. We offered support groups, financial literacy classes, and advocacy for older women facing discrimination or abuse. Margaret Hayes had tried to make me disappear, to reduce me to a footnote in my own life story. Instead, her betrayal had forced me to discover strength I'd never known I possessed. Charles's abandonment had broken my heart, but it had also broken the chains that had kept me tethered to a life defined entirely by other people's expectations. On my 80th birthday, I stood on the front porch of the house I'd almost lost, surrounded by women who'd become my chosen family. Sarah lived with me now by choice rather than necessity, and together we'd created a home filled with laughter, purpose, and mutual support. My grandchildren played in the garden Charles and I had planted together, but the flowers blooming there now were varieties I'd chosen myself. The roses still grew along the fence, but I'd added sunflowers and wildflowers that attracted butterflies and birds. The garden, like my life, had evolved into something more beautiful and diverse than what I'd originally planned. As the sun set over our small town, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me of the watercolors I'd been working on, I realized something profound. My story hadn't ended when my husband chose another woman over me. It had only begun. Charles had sought youth and excitement in the arms of a predator, sacrificing everything real and lasting for an illusion that crumbled under the weight of truth. But I had found something better than recaptured youth. I'd found purpose, community, and the deep satisfaction of using my experience to help others navigate the challenges I'd overcome. I thought my story ended when my husband chose another woman. But it was only the beginning of me choosing myself, and in doing so, discovering that the most meaningful chapters of life can be written at any age. At 78, I'd learned to be young again in all the ways that truly mattered. Curious about the future, open to new experiences, and willing to take risks for the sake of growth. Margaret Hayes had tried to steal my past, but she'd inadvertently given me something far more valuable: the freedom to create an entirely new future. Standing on my porch that evening, surrounded by the people who'd chosen to love me for exactly who I was, I smiled and whispered to the gathering darkness. After 55 years of marriage, he chose her over me. And that choice set me free. 2 years had passed since Charles's death, and I'd settled into a routine that felt both familiar and wonderfully new. The Golden Years Women's Network had grown into a regional organization, helping hundreds of older women navigate the challenges of aging with dignity and independence. My art had improved dramatically, and 3 of my paintings now hung in the local library's permanent collection. Life felt peaceful, purposeful, and complete, until the morning Margaret Hayes returned. I was in my garden, deadheading the roses that had survived another harsh winter, when I heard the crunch of gravel in my driveway. Looking up, I saw a woman stepping out of a modest sedan. Her appearance so changed that it took me several moments to recognize her. Gone was the perfectly styled silver hair, replaced by a simple brown bob that showed gray roots. The expensive clothes had been traded for off-the-rack slacks and a plain cardigan. Margaret Hayes looked like what she'd always been underneath the expensive veneer: a tired, aging woman trying to survive in a world that had little use for her. "Eleanor," she said, approaching my garden gate with visible hesitation. "I know you probably don't want to see me, but I need to talk to you. There are things about Charles, about our relationship, that you need to know." My first instinct was to order her off my property. This woman had tried to destroy my life, had manipulated my husband, and had nearly left me homeless. But something in her demeanor stopped me. A vulnerability I'd never seen before, mixed with what looked like genuine desperation. "You have exactly 5 minutes, I said, setting down my pruning shears and crossing my arms. "And whatever you're selling, I'm not buying." Margaret's laugh was bitter and hollow. "I'm not selling anything anymore, Eleanor. I'm here because I'm dying, and there are things I need to make right before I go." The word, dying, cut through my anger like ice water. Whatever else Margaret was, she was a human being, and no one deserved to face death alone. Against my better judgment, I opened the garden gate. "Cancer," she said simply, settling into one of my porch chairs with obvious fatigue. "Stage 4 lung cancer, spread to my liver and bones. The doctors give me 3 to 6 months, maybe less." I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation, but saw only exhaustion and pain. The woman who'd once commanded attention with her beauty and confidence now looked fragile and defeated. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. "That must be frightening." "It is," she admitted. "But it's also clarifying. When you know you're dying, lies become unbearably heavy. And I've been carrying lies about Charles, about our relationship, about things that happened that you deserve to know." She reached into her purse and withdrew a thick manila envelope, worn from handling. "Charles didn't just have an affair with me, Eleanor. He hired me." The words made no sense. What do you mean, hired you? Margaret's hands shook as she opened the envelope, revealing photographs, documents, and what appeared to be a contract written in Charles's careful handwriting. Charles knew about my past from the beginning. He knew about Robert's suicide, about the embezzlement, about everything. He didn't fall in love with me. He recruited me. My world tilted on its axis. That's impossible. Charles was devastated when he learned about your history. He was horrified that you'd manipulated him. No, Eleanor. Charles was horrified that you'd found out the truth about what we'd been doing together. Margaret's voice was steady now, carrying the weight of confession. Charles hired me to seduce him publicly, to give him grounds for divorce that would make you the sympathetic party. The porch seemed to spin around me. I gripped the arms of my chair, trying to process what she was saying. That doesn't make sense. Why would Charles want me to be sympathetic? He was trying to leave me with nothing. Margaret pulled out a document that looked like a legal contract, signed in Charles's distinctive handwriting. Because Charles knew he was dying, Eleanor. He'd been having chest pains and irregular heartbeats for over a year before he confessed our affair. He'd been to specialists in the city, doctors you knew nothing about. His heart condition was terminal, and he knew it. She handed me medical records that bore Charles's name, dated months before his supposed confession. Cardiac specialist appointments, test results showing severe arterial blockage, prognosis that gave him less than 2 years to live. Charles was terrified that when he died, you wouldn't have enough money to maintain your independence, Margaret continued. Teachers' pensions don't provide much for surviving spouses, and he knew you'd never had to manage finances alone. He was afraid you'd end up in some terrible nursing home, forgotten and poor. My hands trembled as I read the medical reports. Charles had known he was dying and had hidden it from me completely. But why create an elaborate charade of betrayal? The life insurance, I whispered, understanding beginning to dawn. Charles had a substantial life insurance policy. Margaret nodded grimly. Which wouldn't pay out if his death looked like suicide. But Charles was considering it, Eleanor. He was so afraid of becoming a burden, so terrified of lingering in pain while you watched him suffer. He confided in me during one of our early meetings, told me he sometimes thought about ending things on his own terms. The pieces began falling into place with horrifying clarity. So he hired you to create a scandal that would make his death look natural and make me the injured party. Exactly. Charles researched insurance law extensively. He knew that if he died of natural causes in the midst of a contentious divorce, and if you were clearly the wronged spouse, you'd receive the full insurance payout plus spousal benefits. But if he simply died while married to you, the insurance money would barely cover his medical debts. Margaret pulled out bank records showing payments to her, carefully disguised as gifts but clearly structured as salary for services rendered. Charles paid me $50,000 over 18 months to play the role of the other woman. My job was to be visible, obvious, and eventually revealed as a fraud so that you would emerge as the sympathetic victim. I stared at the evidence of my husband's elaborate deception, trying to reconcile this calculated manipulation with the man I'd loved for 55 years. But you tried to steal everything. You had power of attorney, you were going to sell the house. That was real, Margaret admitted, her voice heavy with shame. Charles's plan was brilliant, but he made one critical error. He trusted me to stick to the script. When I realized how much money was actually involved, when I saw the potential of his assets and your vulnerability, I got greedy. She looked up at me with eyes that held genuine remorse. I was supposed to disappear after Charles died, leaving you as the clear victim of our affair. Instead, I tried to take everything for myself. Charles never intended for you to go through the hell of fighting for your inheritance. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Everything I'd believed about my husband's betrayal, everything I'd fought against and ultimately overcome, had been orchestrated by Charles himself. He'd broken my heart to save my future, destroyed our marriage to protect my independence. The will, I said numbly. He changed his will to leave me everything. Because I'd gone off script, Margaret explained. When Charles realized I was actually trying to steal from you, he was horrified. He called me from the hospital, threatening to expose our entire arrangement if I didn't back off. That's when he changed the will, trying to protect you from my actual greed instead of my fake manipulation. I sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of Charles's deception and sacrifice. He'd chosen to be remembered as an unfaithful husband rather than risk leaving me unprepared for widowhood. He'd sacrificed his reputation, our marriage, and my love to ensure I'd have the financial resources and legal standing to survive without him. "Why are you telling me this now?" asked finally. "Charles is dead. This secret died with him. Why destroy what little peace I've found?" Margaret was crying now, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Because I stole more than money from you, Eleanor. I stole your chance to say goodbye to a man who loved you more than his own life. I stole your chance to forgive him while he was alive to hear it. I stole your last months together because I was too greedy to follow the plan that was supposed to protect you." She reached into the envelope one final time and withdrew a letter written in Charles's handwriting, sealed and addressed to me. He wrote this before our charade began, with instructions to give it to you only if something went wrong. I was supposed to mail it after his funeral if everything went according to plan. With shaking hands, I opened the letter I should have received 2 years ago. "My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, it means our plan failed and you've learned the truth about Margaret and me. I pray this letter finds you healthy and financially secure, because that was the only purpose of the deception I orchestrated. I have been dying for months, my love. The doctors tell me my heart is failing, and I have perhaps a year to live. I chose not to tell you because I couldn't bear to watch the light fade from your eyes as you watched me fade away. You've spent too much of your life caring for others who were sick or dying. Instead, I hired Margaret to help me create a situation that would ensure your security after my death. I know the pain this has caused you, and I would rather be remembered as an unfaithful husband than leave you vulnerable and poor. You are the love of my life, Eleanor May Thompson Whitfield. Every day of our 55 years together was a gift I never deserved. If this plan works as intended, you will hate me for a time, but you will survive and thrive without me. That matters more than my reputation or your temporary heartbreak. Live well, my darling. Paint those pictures you always dreamed of. Travel to places we never could afford. Make friends who see your worth. Be the woman you were before you became my wife. And know that I loved every version of you I was privileged to know. Your devoted husband, even in death. Earls. I read the letter 3 times before I could speak, tears blurring the words I'd needed to hear 2 years ago. Charles hadn't betrayed me. He'd saved me in the only way his practical mathematical mind knew how. He'd calculated the odds of my survival and manipulated every variable to ensure I'd emerge stronger. He loved you so much, Margaret whispered. Every time we met, he talked about you. Your laugh, your kindness, your terrible cooking, your beautiful paintings. He was never interested in me as a woman. I was just a tool to protect the woman he adored. I looked at Margaret Hayes, no longer the predator who'd tried to destroy my life, but a dying woman who'd been hired to break my heart and had instead broken her own moral compass. "What happened to the money he paid you?" "Gone," she said simply. "Cancer treatment isn't cheap, and I have no insurance. The $50,000 Charles gave me is long spent on medical bills and basic survival. I'm dying broke and alone, which feels like appropriate justice." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across my porch, I sat with the woman who'd nearly destroyed me and the letter that explained everything I'd never understood. Charles's betrayal had been an act of love so profound and misguided that it took my breath away. But the most shocking realization was yet to come. As Margaret prepared to leave, she pulled out one final document from her envelope, a birth certificate that would change everything I thought I knew about our family. "There's one more thing, Eleanor. Something Charles never knew. Something that changes everything about why I agreed to help him in the first place. Just when you think you know the whole truth, everything changes again. The document Margaret shows Eleanor next will reveal a family secret that's been hidden for over 50 years. Make sure you're subscribed because next chapter will expose the most shocking twist in this entire story. The birth certificate was yellowed with age, dated 53 years ago, bearing a name that made my blood run cold. Margaret Hayes Thompson, born Margaret Thompson. My maiden name. "We're sisters, Eleanor," Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of a lifetime of secrets. "Half-sisters, to be precise. We share the same father." I stared at the document in shock, my mind reeling as I tried to process this impossible revelation. The woman who'd tried to destroy my marriage, who'd manipulated my husband and nearly left me destitute, was my sister. "That's impossible," I whispered, but even as I said it, I could see the resemblance I'd never noticed before. The shape of her eyes, the line of her jaw, the way she held her hands when she was nervous. All echoes of features I'd seen in my own mirror for 78 years. Margaret settled back into her chair, her dying body seeming to find relief in finally sharing this burden. "Our father was Thomas Thompson. Your father. He had an affair with my mother, Helen Hayes, when you were 25 and already married to Charles. I remembered that time. Charles and I were newlyweds, struggling to make ends meet on his beginning teacher's salary. My father had been working construction then, traveling to different job sites around the state. There had been periods when he'd been gone for weeks at a time, sending money home but rarely calling. My mother was a waitress at a diner near one of his construction sites," Margaret continued. "She was young, unmarried, and desperately lonely. When she found out she was pregnant, your father promised to leave your mother and marry her. The story unfolded like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. My father, the man I'd idolized for his work ethic and devotion to our family, had lived a double life I'd never suspected. While my mother had been home raising me and keeping house, he'd been building a relationship with another woman. But he never left," I said, knowing how the story would end. "No. When I was born, he took one look at me and disappeared. My mother never heard from him again. She raised me alone, working 3 jobs to keep food on our table and a roof over our heads." Margaret pulled out a faded photograph showing a young woman holding a baby. The woman had Margaret's eyes and smile, but there was something familiar about her features that made my stomach churn with recognition. I grew up knowing I had a sister somewhere, a legitimate daughter who got everything I was denied, a father who acknowledged her, a family that wasn't broken by secrets and abandonment. Do you know what that does to a child, Eleanor? Knowing that somewhere out there is a family you'll never be part of. I thought about my childhood, stable and secure despite our modest means. My father had been present, if not always emotionally available. He'd taught me to drive, walked me down the aisle at my wedding, bounced my children on his knee. All while Margaret had grown up fatherless, carrying the burden of being an unwanted secret. "When did you find out about me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I hired a private investigator when I turned 40. I was going through my second divorce then, and I suppose I was looking for some explanation for why I kept choosing men who would abandon me." Margaret's laugh was bitter and self-aware. "The investigator found you easily enough. Eleanor Thompson Whitfield, living in a small town an hour from where I was born, married to a mathematics teacher, mother of 2 children. She'd known about me for 25 years. 25 years of watching my life from afar while I'd been completely unaware of her existence. I used to drive by your house sometimes," she admitted. "I'd park down the street and watch you working in your garden or hanging laundry on the line. You looked so peaceful, so content. You had everything I'd always wanted. A stable marriage, children who respected you, a place in the community. The stalking should have frightened me, but instead, I felt a profound sadness for the broken woman sitting on my porch. Margaret had been drawn to the life I'd built because it represented everything she'd been denied by our father's abandonment. Is that why you agreed to help Charles?" "Yes. Because you wanted to destroy what I had." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer. "At first, yes. When Charles approached me with his plan, I saw it as an opportunity for revenge. Here was my chance to hurt the daughter who'd gotten everything while I'd gotten nothing. She reached into her purse and withdrew another photograph, this one showing our father as a young man. The resemblance between Charles and Thomas Thompson was startling. The same height, the same gentle eyes, the same way of holding their shoulders. But the more time I spent with Charles, the more I understood why our father had failed us both. Charles was everything Thomas Thompson should have been. Loyal, devoted, willing to sacrifice anything for the woman he loved. Watching Charles plan his elaborate deception to protect you made me realize how much our father had failed both of us. I studied the photograph of my father, seeing him clearly for the first time. Not the hard-working provider I'd remembered, but a man who'd fathered a child and abandoned her to protect his reputation and legitimate family. Charles never knew we were sisters. Yes. Never. He researched my criminal background thoroughly, but he never looked into my family history. Why would he? I was just a tool to him, a means to ensure your financial security. Margaret's voice carried a note of admiration. He was so focused on protecting you that he never questioned why I was willing to participate in his plan. The irony was devastating. Charles had unknowingly hired my sister to break up our marriage, and Margaret had unknowingly agreed to help the husband of the sister she'd resented for decades. But you went off script, I said, remembering how Margaret had tried to steal everything after Charles's death. You tried to take it all. Margaret nodded, shame coloring her features. By the time Charles died, I'd spent months watching you two together, seeing how much he loved you, understanding what real devotion looked like. I should have stuck to the plan, should have disappeared and let you inherit everything cleanly. She looked up at me with eyes that mirrored my own. But old habits die hard, Eleanor. I'd spent my entire life taking what I could get, surviving by manipulating others. When I saw the opportunity to finally claim some of what I felt had been denied me, I couldn't resist. You tried to steal from your own sister, I said, the words heavy with disappointment and grief. Yes. And in doing so, I put you through months of hell that Charles never intended. The legal battles, the public humiliation, the fear of losing your home. None of that was supposed to happen. Charles's plan was designed to spare you pain, not multiply it. I sat in silence, processing the magnitude of the deception, manipulation, and family tragedy that had shaped the last years of my life. My husband had loved me enough to orchestrate his own downfall. My sister had hated me enough to try to destroy me, then loved me enough to confess the truth. Why tell me this now? Asked finally. Why not take these secrets to your grave? Margaret's answer was simple and devastating. Because I'm dying and I want to die as your sister, not your enemy. Because Charles deserves to be remembered for the love he showed, not the betrayal he performed. And because you deserve to know that even in our twisted, broken way, you were loved by both of us. She stood to leave, her movements slow and painful. The cancer was clearly advancing, robbing her of strength and time. At the garden gate, she turned back to me one final time. I know I don't have the right to ask for forgiveness, Eleanor. I've done too much damage, caused too much pain. But I want you to know that watching you these past few years, seeing how you've rebuilt your life and helped other women, it's made me proud to be your sister. As Margaret's modest sedan pulled out of my driveway, I sat alone on my porch with the weight of revelations that had rewritten my entire understanding of my life. Charles hadn't betrayed me. He'd loved me so deeply that he'd been willing to be remembered as unfaithful rather than leave me vulnerable. Margaret hadn't been a random predator. She'd been my sister, acting out a lifetime of resentment and abandonment issues created by our father's failures. The Golden Years Women's Network meeting was scheduled for that evening, and as I prepared to face the women who'd become my chosen family, I realized that my story had taken another unexpected turn. I'd thought I was helping strangers, but perhaps I'd been unconsciously trying to heal the sister wound I'd never known I carried. I saw recognition in their eyes. So many of us carried family secrets, wounds inflicted by fathers and husbands and children who'd failed to love us as we deserved. But Margaret's confession had taught me something profound about forgiveness and family. Blood relationships didn't guarantee love, But love could transcend the complications of blood. Charles had loved me enough to sacrifice his reputation. Margaret had loved me enough to confess her deception. And I had loved them both enough to forgive them for the pain they'd caused. 3 weeks later, Margaret Hayes died in hospice care, alone except for the flowers I'd brought to her bedside. At her funeral, I was the only mourner, the only person to claim relationship with a woman who'd lived her entire life as someone's secret. I buried my half-sister with the dignity she'd never been granted in life, and I grieved not just for her death but for all the years we'd lost, all the sisterhood that could have been if our father had been brave enough to claim both his daughters. Eleanor's story of betrayal, redemption, and shocking family secrets shows us that life can surprise us at any age. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, have you ever discovered a family secret that changed everything you thought you knew? Sometimes the most shocking revelations come when we least expect them, proving that our stories are never really finished until our final breath. If my story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, what would you do if the love of your life betrayed you at 78 years old? Have you ever had to rebuild your life from scratch? I'd love to hear your stories of resilience and new beginnings.